We have an interesting program here tonight with Ken Gloss, the owner of the Brattle Book Shop in Boston. He was twice snowed out in February, and the first Monday in the so we moved it up to the middle Monday of February, and we had another snowstorm then. So fortunately, it didn't snow today, so he is out here. He's out here to talk about books. Since maybe it's because we had two notices of the program in February that more people were aware of it, but I had more people in the last few months asking me when the antiquarian book guy was coming out here than I can ever remember for any other speaker. So I didn't know how many chairs to set up. I thought we might have 100. I don't know. Anyway, and I see everybody here brought a book bag. Ken is never going to get out of here. Ken Gloss is a guy who said he likes short introductions.
What I do in a talk, the talk will last 45 minutes to an hour. The first half hour, I'll talk about what is an old book, first editions, signed editions, a little bit of my background and history, some stories, anecdotes of places I've been, people I've seen. I'll show off a few of the things that I brought. But then in the next 10 or 15 minutes, I like to do question and answer because I can go on and on and on and on about old books. And at least with question and answer, I can go on about what you want to listen to. The last minute or two of the talk, I will appraise one or two books from the audience to the whole audience in detail. After that, I'll end the formal part of the talk. I'll stay, I'll answer any and all questions, I'll do all the appraisals. I'll just do them a lot more quickly so we can get out of here tonight. And I guess the first thing that comes up when you talk about old books is what is an old book? And usually people mean by that, what's a valuable old book? Well, the first printed book was in 1456, the Gutenberg Bible. If any of you have a Gutenberg Bible, let me assure you that it's valuable. The last time one came up for sale, half of it sold for $5.5 million. Single pages sell between $50,000 and $100,000, and some even more. But any book printed in the 1400s has value, some more than others, but anything in the 1400s is valuable. After that, it depends on what the book is. A book can be printed in the 1500s that was a relatively dull and uninteresting book then, and it's still a relatively dull and uninteresting book now. And people won't pay very much for it. It's not very high priced. On the other hand, you can have relatively recent books. The first edition of the first Harry Potter book in London, it's not that old, sells for $30,000 or $40,000. And I get loads of people at the store who come in or call and say, I have an old book and I know it's an old book. And the way I know it's old is the pages are all brown and crumbling. Well, I point out that's more lousy paper than it is how old the book is. Now, this is a page from a book, and I'm going to pass this around, but you'll see it's not terribly fragile. The paper's white, the ink's black. It's a book called The Nuremberg Chronicle. It's one of the first books done with illustrations. It was printed in the 1490s. So this page is a little over 500 years old. And you sort of say to yourself, well, gee, if they could make a book like that then, why don't they do it now? Well, there was a big disadvantage to a book like that. First of all, in the 1490s, you had to be quite wealthy to get an education, to learn how to read. You had to be almost nobility to be able to afford to buy a book like that. Nowadays, maybe the books aren't quite as well made, but they're at a price that can be distributed in the millions. And the real value of books is the knowledge in the books and the dissemination of that knowledge, and I think it's a very good trade-off. Inevitably, when you come to an organization or talk to people about book collecting, somebody will come up and say, I have a first edition. How much is it worth? And I point out that most first editions never came out in a second edition, probably never should have come out in a first edition. Nobody wants them, cares about them, or would pay anything whatsoever. A book has to be historically, scientifically, literarily, or for some other reason important that there's a group of collectors out there who want it. And usually when you think of first editions, you think of literature. Dickens, Twain, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and so on. And even within that, there are a lot of things that can make a big difference in the price. The condition being one of the most important. The paper dust jacket on a 20th century book can make all the difference in the world. My father had a copy of William Faulkner's second book called Mosquitoes. Absolutely pristine, as if someone took it from the publisher, sealed it away. When he got it, he sold it within a week for $750. At the exact same time, another book dealer in the Boston area had the same book, Mosquitoes, Faulkner, first edition, but it didn't have the paper jacket on it. A few tiny little nicks and bumps, nothing terrible. It took them a year to sell it at $40. Because a lot of collecting is prestige. It's being able to say, look what I've got. I've got the best. I've got the most wonderful. Essentially, I have what you don't have. And people who can afford it will pay absolute top price for the very, very best, but might not consider spending anything at all for something even slightly less. Other things that can affect the value, signed by the author. Well, once again, if the author's unknown, unheard of, the fact that it's signed doesn't mean that much. Maybe one of your relatives wrote a book of poetry, had 50 copies, signed it, gave it to family members. It might mean an awful lot to your family, but it doesn't add much to the price. On the other hand, if it's signed by someone famous, maybe Ernest Hemingway, that could add hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to the value. In almost any type of collecting that you get into, there are nuances that add or subtract to the value, and I use signed books to show that off a little. There are some authors that are almost impossible to get their signature. J.D. Salinger, who wrote Catcher in the Rye, he lived up in New Hampshire, he was reclusive, he didn't appear in public, he essentially didn't publish, and other than to a very close personal friend, absolutely would not sign a book. Thus, his signature adds thousands of dollars to the value because you just can't get them. Now, in a little aside, and I usually don't say this, but once in a while it comes up and people ask me, gee, is there anything that you didn't buy or you wish you had bought or that came in and you just didn't get? And there was, a number of years ago, a man came in, he had been friends with Salinger, and he had a group of letters from Salinger, and they were valuable in themselves, but there was one letter I particularly liked. Salinger was looking back on when he moved to New Hampshire and built his house. And he was writing to this man that there were a group of high school kids who helped build the house and the foundation. And he said, and one of those kids I think really became a fairly good ball player, but that kid Carlton Fisk. So Carlton Fisk helped build J.D. Salinger's house. I really wanted to buy the letter. As far as, I don't know, they just didn't want to sell it. But in any case, anyways, letters and books signed by Salinger are very valuable. There are some authors, though, that sign a lot of their books. There was a local author who wrote books on New England coast, pirates, buried treasure, ghost stories. Maybe some of you knew him or heard him speak, Edward Rose Snow. Now, Snow used to sign a lot of his books. Matter of fact, he was a friend of my father's, and I knew him. And I remember one day he came in our store, and he said he had just been on Cape Cod, and Snow had gone into a store that he had never been in before. He went right up to the section where his books were, pulled one off the shelf, opened it up, and exclaimed, "My, a rare, unsigned copy." and then he took out his pen and signed it. And then he introduced himself to the owner of the store. So books signed by Edward Rose Snow don't add as much to the value. My father had a copy of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic, The Great Gatsby. Now, just opposite what I was saying before, it was a first edition, but it didn't have the paper dust jacket. It was well worn and read. But when you opened it up, it was inscribed to the greatest living poet, T.S. Eliot, sincerely F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, in addition to that inscription, when T.S. Eliot read the book, he made marginal notes, annotations, comments, crossed things out, added things in to just about every page of the book. That book now would be worth $200,000, $300,000, maybe even $400,000 because of the association. One last story about autographs and manuscripts. There was an autograph and manuscript dealer in New England. He was one of the most prominent in the world. But when he was a young boy, he used to collect books by Robert Frost. And he knew Robert Frost. And when he was 13 years old, he went to London and he bought a copy of Frost's first book called A Boy's Will. He paid a very high price for it at the time. And it's very complicated what really is the first edition. Came back to Boston. A few weeks later, he met with Frost. He was very proud of himself. He said, "Look what I've got." Frost looked at it, said, "What did you pay for it?" He told him, and Frost said, give me the book. Frost opened it up, and the front two end papers wrote a 2-page description of how to tell the first binding from the second, from the third, from the fourth, how they change bindings, why they change bindings, the different colors of the bindings, on and on and on for 2 pages, signed it, closed the book, handed it back to the boy, and said, "Now it's worth what you paid for it." In any case, let me digress a little, give you a little bit of my background, the history of the store. The history of the Brattle Book Shop goes back to the 1820s, but for all practical purposes, it was going out of business in 1949. My father was getting married, my mother had $500, and with that, they bought half interest in the store. And it's always been in Boston. People call us all the time. They're in Harvard Square on Brattle Street. Where are you? We tell them we're in downtown. When my father first bought the store, it was a little side street in what was called Scully Square. To make it even more confusing, the street doesn't even exist anymore. It's where Boston City Hall Plaza is now. And my father built the business with his great love of books, his hard work, his knowledge. He was a bit of a character and a showman. We've had 7 different locations over the years, mainly due to urban renewal. And every time we moved, when it was planned, my father would move the best books to his new location, then run sales. Half-price dollar, 50-cent quarter, dime. Last day of the sale, though, everything was free. And he would literally have hundreds of people line up with bags, packs, satchels, whatever. Ring a big bell, the people would go charging into the store, grab whatever they could grab. 5 minutes later, he'd ring the bell again, that group would leave, the next group would come in, and he gave away over 250,000 books that way. Now, the last time he did this was in 1969, and we were moving from the end of Washington Street to West Street, where we are now. And at the end of the giveaway, there were books left over. And like I said, my father was a bit of a character and a showman. And if you can sort of picture this, he hired a covered wagon with a cowboy and a horse team, and they filled it up with books. And on the cover of the covered wagon, it said, "Go west, book lovers. Go 5 West Street, Brattle Book Shop." And they drove it from the end of Washington Street near Boston City Hall, up Court Street, down Tremont by the Boston Common to where West Street is, and then back down Washington Street with my father sitting in back, throwing books out the whole way. Now, the superintendent in charge of traffic was a friend, told him he could do it all morning, but within an hour, the city was at an absolute standstill. They told him to stop. He didn't care. He had gotten his point across. And we've been on West Street since then. When we first moved in, we were in a 5-story, 150-year-old wooden building, absolutely crammed full of books. In February of 1980, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning. The building was on fire. It literally burnt to the ground. I mean, it was 100% gone. But we wanted to continue to keep going, not go out of business. We found a storefront a few doors down the street. We rented folding tables. People either sold, donated, gave us books. Kevin White, who was the mayor at the time, came down with a carload of books. And even though it was a meager stock, within a month we reopened. And the main thing was just continue. Now, over the next 4 years, we slowly but surely rebuilt the stock. 4 years after that, we moved into the building we're in now. We bought the building, which is, again, a few doors down on West Street. And it's sort of the old Dickensian type of store. Outside stands at $1.03 and $5, 2 floors of general used books, and then a 3rd floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, first editions, leather bindings, and so on. And that type of business, the large, old, general, secondhand bookstore, is a dying business. It's not dying because people don't like books, read books, buy and sell books. But particularly in the last 20 or 30 years in the inner cities, property value has gone so high, that rent has gone so high, that old bookstores, which are not the most efficiently run businesses in the world, one right after the other have been going out of business. And in the last few years, the internet has just speeded that process along. Now, like I say, we bought our building in the early 80s, so I hope to do this for years to come. I have daughters who are in their late 20s, early 30s. I don't think they have any interest in coming into it the way I did. And I've done this all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I don't know, it might have been. I'm sure they were talking about them all the time. And I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin, but in 1973, I needed a year off. That year now, my father's health wasn't that good, but that year now is over 40 years. And I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. If you were to ask me, what's one item I wish I could find, it's a little pamphlet here called Tamerlane by a Bostonian. It was done in 1827. It doesn't look like very much. It's just a little pamphlet. But the Bostonian who did this was Edgar Allan Poe. It's his first book. It's a classic rarity in American literature. The first copy to ever show up was in the 1890s on a book dealer's 10-cent table. Another book dealer spotted it there, bought a stack of books so it wouldn't stand out, and in 1890 sold it for $1,000. Then in the 1950s, there were two postmen in the New Bedford area who on the side were book scouts. And being postmen, they knew where all the yard sales were. They bought a trunk of books. Bottom of the trunk was a Tamerlane. Families got involved. They got to negotiating. After 6 months, they sold it for $10,000. Now, I don't know if it was worth it because they started out best of friends. By the time they sold it, they never spoke again. But they got their $10,000. And then about 10 or 12 years ago, an antique dealer died in the New Bedford area. His whole estate was auctioned. Paintings, prints, whatever, furniture. Books, as a group, sold to an antique dealer in New Hampshire. They took all the pamphlets, put them in a box, $15 each. Someone, of course, pulled out a Tamerlane, and 10 years ago sold it for $198,000. And one sold a year or two ago for $800,000. And let me just say, this is a facsimile. A lot of what I bring with me are original, but I don't bring million-dollar pamphlets. But if any of you want to take a close look and then go home and check your attic, cellars, basements, whatever, if you find one, please give me a call. A lot of the fun of collecting is learning about something, is studying it, is appreciating it. It's really your knowledge that makes something interesting and thus valuable. I mean, someone might look at something and say, oh, that's a scrap of paper. Someone else might say, that's a broadside that led to the Boston Tea Party, that led to the American Revolution, that led to our country's independence. So it's really that knowledge and understanding that makes items interesting, thus valuable. Now, here's an item that on the surface I think is interesting, but the story behind it is maybe even more so. This is on White House stationery. It's dated April 11th, 1933, and it starts, Dear Jim, I want to send you this note to tell you how happy I am that you are to represent the United States in Poland. It's a most important post, etc., signed always sincerely, Franklin Roosevelt, and it's to the Honorable James Michael Curley, Mayor of Boston. Now, on the surface, this seems like a great honor. It's an ambassadorial appointment. Well, Curley didn't think it was such an honor. Matter of fact, I think he thought Roosevelt was trying to get rid of him, which, of course, he probably was. And Curley's response to Roosevelt was, remember, this was 1933. He said, in Poland, with Germany on one side and Russia on the other, you should send your worst Republican enemy to Poland. He said, matter of fact, if you think it's so important, why don't you quit and go there yourself? Now, Curley's impression of Washington didn't change over the years. We also have about 10 letters that he wrote to his wife when he was in Danbury prison. Now, even though these were personal letters, he was still very much the politician. And there was one quote I particularly liked. He had just gotten into jail, and he wrote to his wife, and he said, "Many of the four-legged creatures in my cell have more honor than the two-legged creatures in Washington." In any case, enough for Curley. A lot of what we get aren't just books, but brochures, programs, paper items. And here's one. This is a program from the 1912 World Series where the Red Sox played the Giants. The Red Sox won the World Series in 1912, won a few more times in the teens, had to wait a long time after that, and I don't even want to talk about this year. But this is the original program, and not only is it interesting as a baseball item, but on the back there's an ad for Arrow shirts and collars. Collars are $2 for $1, shirts are $1.50 and $2. I don't think you'll get them for that nowadays. Also, it's become very popular to go on cruises and cruise ships, and I have a brochure here for a ship. Tells you a wonderfully built, where to book passage, and anyone who wants to go on the Titanic. And almost anything you can think of, there are people out there who are interested. There are whole societies of Titanic historians who do nothing but study the Titanic. There's also a tendency, when you talk about collecting, that all of a sudden, everything seems to be worth thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. And I like to point out, not everything has to be high priced to be fun. Old Life magazines, for instance. Here's one with Errol Flynn on the cover. Another with Elizabeth Taylor when she was 15 years old. And the large majority of these sell for $1 or $2 at most. There are a few exceptions, but the large majority are very low price. There are lots of them. We used to have a wall at a store by a stairway where we'd have 100, two of the more famous covers. People would sometimes stop and stare at that wall for a half an hour at a time, just sort of lost in thought and memory. They loved them for the covers, the stories, the articles, the photographs. They made wonderful birthday or anniversary presents if you fell in the right dates. And there was one day a regular customer came in, and he bought about 50 Life magazines from World War II. It wasn't what he normally bought. So I said to him, "Why are you buying these?" And he said, "Well, I want to teach my children about World War II." And he thought a nice way to do it would be to get some of the Lifes, read a few of the articles, look at a couple of the photos, and then discuss it with them. Sounded like a good idea to me. I was a little skeptical. He came in a few weeks later, and I said to him, how's it going with the Lifes? And he said, "Fabulously, but not the way I thought." He says the kids don't care about the stories, the articles, the photographs, but they love the ads. And he says, and it turns out by looking at and discussing the ads with them, he could probably teach them more about what the United States was like during World War II than if they had looked at everything else anyways. I have other things here. I have a cookbook from the 1700s. Some of the recipes are wonderful. And then you have how to bake eels the common way. I don't know if I want to bake them anyway, but in any case. One of the most interesting parts about the business for me is going out to houses and estates. That's how we get most of our books. And it's almost like being Jim Hawkins on Treasure Island every day, never knowing who you're going to see, what you're going to get, the people, the places, the books. And I'll relate a few of those stories to you, and then we'll see about some questions. This was a while ago. I was out of the store. I got back. There was a message that a Mrs. Fisher had called, and she had some books. And I called her up, and she said, "Oh, yes, my father died. He has 500 art reference books in Providence. We want to get the best price we can. We're inviting a number of people down, dealers down to bid on them. Would you be interested?" Well, Providence is only an hour from Boston. 500 art reference books sounds like quite a good library. They lived on an old street called Benefit Street up near Brown University. I got to the house. It was a large, old colonial house. Got led through the house into a courtyard, into a garage, second floor of the garage. They had 5,000 books. Well, it turned out her married name was Fisher. Her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Family founded Brown University, one of the wealthier families in the country. And after about 6 months, I bought about 80% of the books I wanted. I was happy. She was pleased. And she said, "My mother has a lot of books." Most are being given to the university. Some are being sold at auction. But would you like to go to Newport to take a look at the books there? Well, their house in Newport is one of the mansions on the ocean. I mentioned this to my wife. She decided to come with me on this deal. And one of the fascinating parts about it was being in one of those mansions that was still being lived in by a family, and at one point wandering through the whole house from attic to basement without a tour guide saying, "Come here, go here, don't do this, don't do that," but just wandering all on my own. It was fascinating. Another time I got called to Newport to do an appraisal. Now, when I come to groups like this, I do hundreds of free appraisals. Matter of fact, my goal is that whenever you think of an old book, you think of me and the Brattle Book Shop. And one of the ways I feel I can do that is by giving out as much free information as reasonably possible. But there are times when people need very formal appraisals for insurance, estate taxes, whatever. Then I discuss a fee. In any case, another mansion in Newport, not quite as big as the Brown. This was the Perry family. Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry. And what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. Well, they're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. It's all the way you look at it. But it was the day-to-day accountings of the ships. And they would sometimes capture a ship and realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. In 1812, that was an incredible amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got into a battle. The ship got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. 3 days later, there was a tiny entry at the bottom of a page, and it said, "Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg." And that was the last you heard of the captain. So that's changed a little, too. When my father was still alive, and he died almost 30 years ago, we got a call from a lady. She was very vague about her name, who she was, what she had, but it sounded like there might be a few good things. And she lived in Providence. She lived in Sharon, so it was fairly close. We decided to go to her house. We got to the house, and it was a little ranch. The paint was peeling, weeds were growing, and you sort of say to yourself, "Gee, what's going to be here?" She answered the door. She was quite elderly, and we walk in, and there were just gorgeous antiques everywhere. I mean, really, really beautiful antiques. And she got to talking. It turned out she was originally from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of the Tsar of Russia. He had escaped just before the revolution, and she told story after story about being Russian nobility in Europe, all the court intrigues, all the goings-on, how T.E. Shaw used to stay at their house all the time, how she didn't think he accidentally died on a motorcycle, but there was a lot more to it. T.E. Shaw, of course, was Lawrence of Arabia. She went on and on and on with these wonderful stories. Turned out the books were lousy, but the stories were absolutely wonderful. And when we first got into the house, on one of her walls, she had 10 watercolors. They're about this size, pastoral European scenes. And when I first saw them, I thought they were nice. But the longer we were there, and the more she talked, and the more I looked at them, the nicer I thought they were. And I finally said to her, "You know, those 10 watercolors, they're really nice." And she sort of turned around and said, "Oh, yes, they're all Turners." So she had 10 original Turner watercolors, probably $1 million worth of painting. And it was like, "Oh, yes, they're all Turners." So you never know. You never know what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. And matter of fact, speaking of characters, about 15 years ago, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday parties. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday party, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to give a talk in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. And I finally said to him, "Wait a minute, you're 100 years old. Don't you think Tokyo is an awfully long way to go?" And he said, "Well, when I used to work It took me well over 25 hours to get to Chicago. He says, I don't think Tokyo's a whole lot further than that nowadays. And here's a man who could tell you about one day sitting down to dinner with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. And he was obviously a young man. He said he was really looking forward to this dinner and all the learning and insight he was going to get from these two men. He was excited about it. He said he got to the table a few minutes early. 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat down next to him. And about 15 minutes later, Edison came in. Now, Edison was elderly, had one of those big horns for hearing, sat down opposite them. And he said the first thing, Ford turned to Edison and yelled, "My Tom, you look very good." And Edison turned and looked at Ford and yelled, "It's the Carter's little liver pills." This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's little liver pills. And he said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. I can go on and on and on with these stories. I'll tell one more, and then we'll see about, like I say, questions. We get hundreds of phone calls at the store. People wanting to know, do you have a book? Can you get a book? How hard is it to get a book? Does the book exist? Or how much is it worth? What's the value? And so on. Most of those questions, either I or the people I work with, we can answer right off the top of our heads. Some take a little more effort, and occasionally you really have to do some research, but that can be interesting too. But every once in a while you get a call that really stands out. And again, this was a while ago. I answered the phone, "Hello, Brattle Book Shop, can I help you?" Lady, elderly, very thick Irish brogue. And the first thing she says is, "President Kennedy slept with me." Well, you have to admit that gets your attention. And she stopped and waited for it to sink in. And then she went on to explain that she had worked for the Kennedy family. She had been his nursemaid, and when he was 3 and 4 years old, he used to fall asleep in her arms. So he did sleep with her, but not the way you might think. And what she had was a whole series of handwritten letters from the president. Now, presidential letters of any type are valuable. Handwritten letters from a later 20th century president are very scarce, very hard to get, and very valuable. She wanted to get an offer on them. I was actually skeptical about that, but I thought she'd be fun to meet, so I went to her house. She was great, loads of stories. The letters were fabulous. I gave her what I thought was a tremendous offer on them, but much as I suspected, there was no way she could sell these letters. Letters were part of her life. I left a note behind. As far as I know, her family still has them, probably where they belong. Maybe someday I'll hear about them again, but in any case. Like I say, I can go on and on and on, but why don't I see if there are some questions? And quite honestly, anything you ask me, I can go off on a tangent. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
How do you take care of old books?
Well,
Leather-covered books.
the question is, how do you take care of old books, leather-covered books, and so on? Well, the first thing that I say is, unless you're dealing with books that are incredibly valuable, very, like Harvard University, the rare book collections, you're not going to build an atmospherically controlled room in your house with all sorts of alarms and special fire. You're not going to do that. So usually what I tell people is if you're comfortable, the books will be comfortable. If it's not too hot, too cold, too damp, too dry, the books will probably be fine. You don't want to leave them in direct sunlight because they'll tend to fade the ends. You don't want to put them in too tight because someone will pull them like that. Too loose and they'll turn like that. As far as leather-bound books go, if actually handling them isn't the worst thing in the world if you do it right, because the oils from your hand actually doesn't hurt that. But you can get creams for leather-bound books that will keep them moist every few years. But once they've started to dry out, there's not a whole lot you can do. And as with any book, it's a matter of you treat them well. And it also depends a lot on how valuable the book is. Because books can be repaired or fixed, or a lot of things can be done, but a bookbinder or a restorer, they have to earn a living. They have to send their kids to college. They have to pay the rent. And it costs a lot of money to do it right. And if you have a $5 book, and you put a $500 repair on it, you're still going to have a $5 book. Now, if you have a $5,000 book and you put a few $100s into the repair work, that might make sense. And there are two ways to evaluate whether to do it. One is monetary. The other is sentimental. I mean, if you have a book that's been handed down generation to generation to generation in your family, then that's sentimental, and you decide what you want to put into it sentimentally. In any case, I saw someone's hand over here.
Could you speak about the quality of the paper used in certain periods of book production?
Well, the question is the quality of paper used in certain periods of book production. That varies tremendously, and there is no one thing. Now, the page I handed around before, the Nuremberg Chronicle, up until about the Industrial Revolution, after the Civil War, paper was made usually from linen and cloth and that type of thing, and it tended to be better quality and so on. After the Industrial Revolution, a lot of it was made from wood pulps. And depending on how that paper was made, it either would last a while or wouldn't. Now, one of the things, though, it also made paper very cheap. So books could be printed very cheaply. Newspapers could be printed much more cheaply. A newspaper from the Revolutionary War, you can open, read, handle. A newspaper from World War I, you touch it and it crumbles in your hand. But if you made newspapers out of that paper now, well, not only do people not read newspapers that often anymore anyways, but you wouldn't be able to afford to buy the newspapers. And all through time, back in those days, books were very expensive, and part of the reason was paper was expensive. Nowadays, there are books made on very high quality paper and so on, but they're more expensive. On the other hand, the cheaper ones are better. In the last 10 or 15 years, the technology has improved to the point where they're less acidic and so on. And then you get to each specific book and you talk about that one way or the other. The ones, especially during the war periods, tended to be cheaper paper because all the production was going to something else, the war effort. And once you get that cheap paper, it's almost impossible to fix, restore, and so on. Although nowadays they're being scanned and you can Google them and they come up and they're free. Anyone else on questions? No? Tell you what, then why don't at this point, why don't I do one or two appraisals to the audience? Did anyone bring a Bible?
Yes.
All right, well, I can do that if you want. Okay, well then. And did anyone bring a cloth book with a very decorative cloth? That would do. And the reason I'm asking for these has almost nothing to do with value, but they lead into stories. Is that a Bible?
That's the New Testament. There's 2 volumes.
Okay, well, why don't I just take one? Well, okay. In any case, first let me say something about appraising. When I appraise at groups like this, I give a retail value. In other words, that price that you would pay if you came into my store or a store like mine. It is not what you would get if you're selling the book. Usually if you're selling books, you should expect to get about 1/3 to 2/3 of the retail value. If you're dealing in the very low end price-wise, the markup might even be higher just because you've got to make some money. When you get to the much higher priced items, the percentages can come down. For instance, a number of years ago, I bought a copy of Audubon's quadrupeds, not the birds, but the animals, but the big, huge 155 hand-colored plates. At the time, I paid $100,000 for it. I sold it within 2 weeks for $105,000. It's only a 5% markup, but it's $5,000. Well worth the time and effort I spent. And I also pretty much had it pre-sold before I bought it. So when you get into those much higher valued items, the percentages can come down, especially on things that are going to turn over quickly because the amounts of money involved are so much more. Also, everything I say is subjective. In other words, the fact that I say something's worth $100 doesn't mean a colleague of mine doesn't say $125 and another colleague say $75. If you have something you go to somebody, you get a price, you're happy with it, great. If you're not sure, get a second, third, fourth, fifth opinion. There's nothing wrong with that. It's almost more a matter of how much time and effort you want to spend. The first book we have here is Michelangelo. It's, if I can get the title page, it's done in 1875. No, it's not signed by Michelangelo. And let me just say, if it was signed by him in 1875, that's really going some. But that's another whole issue. But it's sculptor, painter, architect, 1875, London. It's black and white. It has some illustrations in it. Actually, the illustrations are pasted in photographs, which is nice because there are people who collect books that have pasted photographs in them. And of course, they were a lot more work than printed because they had to be put into each one. And so there are a number of them here. The book has a few little nicks to the top and bottom, but it's overall in really good condition. And it would probably retail in the $100 range, $125. And the reason is the photographs. If it was just regular printed, it would be $25 to $50. But one of the reasons I wanted a book with a very nice decorative cloth cover is before they widely had dust jackets, and dust jackets started in the early 1800s, but the dust jackets as we know them started around World War I. So before that, publishers used to publish books with very decorative covers, and one of the reasons they did that was they figured if when you walked into the store, if the book caught your eye, better chance you'd buy it. And there are people who collect books like this just for the decorative covers. Individually, they might not seem like that much, but graphically, as a collection, they can be quite wonderful. And you can go to libraries, book sales, historical society, white elephant sales, which I encourage you to, I guess, donate and give to. But you can get them relatively cheaply. There are some that are very expensive. But graphically, as a collection, they can be quite nice. And matter of fact, I have a collection like this myself that started off as a bit of a joke. I got a book one day. It had a picture of a toilet on the cover. And the title of the book was Flushed with Pride, The Life of Thomas Crapper, Invented the Toilet. Well, in any case, I brought it home. I showed it to my wife. She took one look at it, said, we have to put this in the bathroom. So we did. A couple of days later, I got another book and had a big eye staring out of the cover. And the title was We Never Sleep. It was a history of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. But with a big eye staring at you, I said, put that in the bathroom too. Now, it's a little half bathroom, so there's no shower, no steam. Next thing you know, we built bookshelves, and now we have 300 or 400 of these Victorian-style illustrated cloth covers in our bathroom. People walk in, they're a little taken aback, but there's loads of reading material. And one of the rules of the collection is that nothing can be valuable because every once in a while a book falls off the shelf, and you can imagine where it ends up.
Do people spend a lot of time in your bathroom?
Occasionally. I like to finish the talk talking about Bibles. And one of the reasons I like to do that is the Bible is the most commonly printed book of all time, always has been, probably always will be. And we sometimes can get 5 and 10 calls a week that people have 100, 200-year-old family Bibles. And in most cases, we have to say to them, if this is your family Bible and it's been handed down through the generations, sentimentally, it's priceless. Monetarily, it might not be worth that much, but sentimentally, it's priceless. Now, it's always worth checking because there's loads of exceptions, and there's the Gutenberg Bible, there are others, so it's always worth checking. And if you get one of those big, old Victorian Bibles with the beautifully embossed covers, with the clasps and so on, they usually sell in the $100 to $300 range because they're in perfect shape because they make wonderful gifts for ministers, priests, divinity students. But break one class, have one hinge go, they lose all that value. Sometimes in the middle, the beginning, end, you'll have the family history, the town, births, deaths, marriages. Those can be invaluable to the historical society, but many times they don't want the whole Bible. They just want to copy out that page, maybe the title page. They don't want the whole one. Now, the book brought in here actually is not a Bible. This isn't a Bible. It's a life of Jesus. And it's illustrated by a man named Tizot, the life of our Lord Jesus Christ. And this is actually a very common book. It shows up a lot. It's beautifully done. It has color illustrations in it. One of the problems with the colored illustrations in this, people won't be able to see it. Well, you can see it, is that if it gets it even the least bit damp, one of the reasons a lot of books have tissues in them is to keep them from sticking, and in this one, they've stuck a lot. It's a relatively common book, but with the damage, it really has very little value. In mint condition, this would sell for a few $100s, but because of the damage and because it's relatively common, it's not particularly valuable at all, and it's not worth repairing because you could probably buy a better one in new condition cheaper than you could repair it. Now, one of the things that I will mention just before I end is that I hope people watch it. As a matter of fact, I'm taping it just about now, Antiques Roadshow on PBS, and I've appraised for the Roadshow for the last 15, 16 years. And the way that show works is you appraise on a Saturday at a convention center, and there's a hall, and there's about 75 or 80 appraisers at tables with 3 book appraisers sitting next to the music appraisers, next to the jewelry appraisers, next to the ceramics, glass, so on, around a big hall. About 5,000 people come to a show. You appraise from about 7:30 in the morning till sometimes 8 or 8:30 at night, almost nonstop. Each person has 2 items, so there's about 10,000 items that come in. And they tape around 55, 60 items, which is what makes up 3 hours of television from each city. Now, I say they start coming in at 7:30, but as appraisers, you've even got to be there a little bit early. And there was one city that we were there with the book appraiser, and we were saying to ourselves, how many Bibles do you think we'll see today? So we decided to count 80. 80 family Bibles in one day in one city came in. As a matter of fact, now depending on who the other appraisers are, occasionally we have a pool going in it. One last story about Bibles. I got a call a number of years ago to a large old, well over 100-year-old church in Boston. They had a huge library, and they just wanted to know if over the years they had accumulated any books that were valuable. And I spent a day there, and they had some great books. It was actually a lot of fun. At the end of the day, the priest said to me, could you come down the basement? There were a few more books. Went down the basement, looked at those. And then there was a closet, maybe sort of more like that vestibule room. The priest opened the door front to back, floor to ceiling, top to bottom. It was stuffed with thousands of old Bibles. And I looked at the priest and I said, what is this? And he said, well, people hate to throw away a book. They feel it's sacrilegious to throw away a Bible. So what happens when a parishioner dies and the family doesn't want the Bible? They come and they present it to the church. And he says, what do? We very graciously accept it. We don't want to offend anybody. Then we go downstairs, open the door, throw it in with the rest of them. And he says, and we can't drive a dumpster up to the back of the church and fill it full of Bibles. That would just be terrible. So I use it as an excuse to say, if you want to give something to a charity, ask them if they want it first. If they want it and can use it, fabulous. But if all you're doing is taking your old job, you're really not doing anyone a favor. I'm not bashful about it. I have my card here. We have 800 numbers, websites, and all of that. Don't ever feel you're bothering myself, the people I work with, the staff. We'd rather have 100 people call with nothing special than to have the 101st person say, I just threw away a Tamerlane. Now, the way I do the appraisals is I'll end the formal part of the talk. I do it more in a crowd scene. If anyone wants to stand over my shoulder and listen, that would be fine. But the less order there is, the faster it goes. And basically, I'll just say thank you very much, and then just bring things up. And I won't do it to the audience, but just thank you, and then just bring things up. Thank you very much.
The preceding was a production of Medfield TV, Community Shows.